Hello, my name is Mona Salloum. I am the very proud daughter of Habeeb Salloum, the author of Arab Cooking on a Prairie Homestead. Today, I'm going to be reading a short section from one of his chapters in his book, and I hope you enjoy it. Every morning, my father would wake my brother and me at 4 a.m. and take us to the fields to help remove the many rocks. As tiny tots, we could pick only the very small stones while my father labored with the large boulders. We picked stones morning after morning. The task was unending, so that even as a child, I came to loathe the sight of piled rocks. Around 7 a.m., we would return to enjoy a hearty breakfast, which my mother always prepared. After the meal, my father would go to plow the fields while my brother and I helped with the chores around the house. These were pleasant tasks compared to the picking of the terrible stones. The virgin land being plowed by my father hosted many wild animals and birds, which were found on the South Saskatchewan plains. Almost every day when my father returned from the fields, he would bring a few prairie chickens or rabbits for our daily meals. There was no problem keeping the extra meat. In summer, we put the meat in a pail, then lowered it into a well to just above the water line. In the winter, an outside shed made for an excellent refrigerator. Even though meat was important, it was only one item in our diet. During the spring and summer months, my mother would scour the nearby fields for the roots and edible greens known to her from her youth in the old country. In addition, every year she had a thriving vegetable garden, which, with my brothers and my help, was watered by hand. From this excellent garden, she kept us fed for the whole year. What we did not eat during the summer, she dried or cooked in jars for winter use. Hence, even though money was very scarce, we were always well fed. The excellent crop in 1928 made my parents forget the hardships of their first homesteading year. They planned for a rosy future, but fate did not look kindly on their many dreams. Thereafter, the bountiful years were few and far between. In 1929, there was a small crop, but nothing to compare with the previous year. The stock market crashed, bringing on the depression, and, as if to magnify the catastrophe, Mother Nature refused to send the life-giving rains. It would be some years before the grain would again grow. In no time, the land in that part of southern Saskatchewan became a desert waste. For the next 3 years, nothing grew, and the soil blew back and forth like the deserts of Arabia. How many times my father and mother must have cursed the day they came to this land where they had thought the streets were paved with gold. During these years, our neighbors, the nearest being 3 miles away, began to abandon their parched farms, but my father, with an expanding family, could not afford to move away. Besides, the harsh life which was forcing many of the people to leave did not affect us in the same way as it did our neighbors. Like many Arab immigrants, we were able to survive better than many members of various ethnic groups due to the experience of agrarian, subsistence-level living that had been practiced by my parents in their homeland. In the Bekaa Valley, where my parents hailed from, my parents had grown chickpeas and lentils, crops that had, through the centuries, adapted to the desert climate. These we now seeded, and every year our garden of chickpeas and lentils thrived, aided by hand-drawn water from our well. For meat, besides the wild partridges and rabbits, we raised chickens and a few sheep and cows that lived off the little grass and bushes which grew in the valleys. Although we had enough to eat, clothing was another matter. My mother made our shirts, overalls, and other garments from canvas or flour bags and any used discarded clothing that she could find. Like most Arab immigrants, my parents' desire to survive and try to prosper in a foreign land gave them the impetus to improvise. For us children, there was not much excitement growing up during these years. Going into the town of Val-Marie was an event my older brother and I looked so much forward to with great anticipation. In the period we lived on the homestead, I remember journeying only twice with my father to Val-Marie, which appeared to me to be a huge metropolis, a fairyland center which filled my dreams. The 18-mile trip to Val-Marie by horse and buggy or sleigh was usually, especially in the winter, a 2-day journey. With no money for a hotel, we slept overnight with our horses in the livery barn, spreading out bales of hay for our beds. Years later, I returned to that town, which by then had only 48 residents. No one I talked to knew that there had been in that little place a livery barn. In the intervening years, I had realized that my childhood thoughts had been far from reality, but I did not know how far. All there was left from that metropolis of my dreams was a number of businesses and a few homes. "'Tis better to live in a world of fantasy," I thought to myself as I surveyed the scene. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you. My name is Leila. I'm Habeeb Salloum's daughter. Habeeb Salloum's story is one of perseverance, determination, hard work, inspiration, and success. He and my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, were part of the Syrian immigration to Canada. My grandparents specifically being part of the wave of immigrants to push the western frontier of Canada forward. They left Syria in the early 1920s and arrived in southwestern Saskatchewan, where they eventually homesteaded and owned a farm. They came at a time when life was not easy. Firstly, they had left a land that they were born in and generations of their family. Their homeland had the language of Arabic. The new land did not. The cultural idiosyncrasies of their village of Karaoun in Syria was not the same as that of the prairies of southwestern Saskatchewan. Yet they persevered. There were trials and tribulations that they were challenged with daily, that they met with full force and overcame. These were the natural hazards of living on the western prairies at the time. The dust storms and the blazing heat in the summer, the blistering cold and the blizzards and the cold winds in the winter. Then there were the grasshoppers and the gophers. There were the coyotes, the jackrabbits, the barren land, especially during the drought, that they were able to overcome. They saw many of their neighbors leave to Eastern Canada, to the United States. They could not survive during these times of drought and depression. Yet my grandfather stayed. He was committed to staying. He couldn't go back. They had no money and they did not have the means to go back. So they had to beat the odds, which they did, and remained homesteading and then farming during those years. Eventually, a school was built near their farm, the Minot School, and my father, who had waited to attend school, to read books, the love of his life to read books, was able to go. He and my uncle, Habeeb, were old enough to go to school. My father remembers distinctly the library at the school. 200 books, he said, 200 books which he read, reread, and then read again. He almost memorized them. The poetry by Robert Service affected him very much because Robert Service in the poem of Sam McGee, the poem reminded him of the cold of Saskatchewan's winters. But the other books that he read opened a new world to him. The world of Asia, the world of the Middle East, the world of South America, peoples and nations and cultures and peoples that he would only dream of meeting. That was his outlet in that library. Back in class, things were different. My father distinctly remembers everybody faced the depression, everybody faced the drought, everybody faced the blizzards, etc. But my father and my uncle were faced with another form of trials and tribulations, and that was bullying, what we call today bullying. At that time, there were racist remarks made against my uncle and my father with no one to defend him, not even a teacher to defend him. These were the new kids in town, as they say, but they were strange. Their hair was too dark. Their complexion was too dark. They spoke English with an accent. They dressed funny. They dressed different. They didn't look the same. And they ate weird. For instance,
my grandmother packed daily sandwiches for my uncle and my father. And these would involve either, let's say, fried eggplant or a fried vegetable put between Arabic bread, homemade Arabic bread. But many times labni, which is a yogurt spread, a strange yogurt spread that the Arabs in the Middle East eat almost on a daily basis, wrapped up in with a little bit of oil in Arabic bread, like a bread roll up. My father would eat that, and the kids would start making fun of him, throw the sandwiches, throw their food away, say they were animals for eating this type of food, etc. That my father eventually found himself eating his lunch behind a tree in the schoolyard, just so the kids wouldn't make fun of him anymore. He couldn't take it. One day, he told my grandparents he didn't want to go to school, and my grandparents knew something was up, something was wrong for Habeeb to say he did not want to go to school. And finally, they got it out of him. And when my father told him they keep beating us up and calling us Black Syrian, my grandfather became so enraged, probably one of the angriest times my father ever saw my grandfather. And I guess he was just thinking to himself, I left everything I knew and came to this land, and they're not accepting us, they're not accepting us. And he told my father, you go back to school and tell them Jesus Christ was a Black Syrian, and let's see how they react to that. Let's see if they call you Black Syrian again, which they did. But it gave my father a little more strength, knowing he did nothing wrong. And that's the bad part about the bullying, because you feel like you want to hide into a cocoon somehow, which my father did initially. But at the same time, the other bad aspect is the alienation. So my grandparents as a family, as a functional family, outside of that family, many times did feel alienated when they went into town to Governor or to other towns, especially when my grandfather would pick up goods that they needed for either during the summer or during the winter, and people didn't treat him the same. There was an instance when the government was giving out items for the farmers because of the drought and in Western Canada, and farmers could come in and collect a bag of, I don't remember what it was, but they could collect whatever it was the government was giving out. And everybody had their horse and buggy, and they were standing in line. And finally, it was the turn of my dad to go up, drive the horse and buggy up. And another neighbor, I don't know if it was a neighbor, but someone else said, get back, you can't, you don't look Canadian, go back. And they pushed them out of the line, and they ended up fighting. Everybody ended up fighting. But to prove themselves as Canadians, that was the worst part. To alienate them, that wasn't welcome either. But at the same time, it did not stop my father and his family from continuing. And they continued, they persevered. The sad times, the rough times were compensated by the winter evenings around the coal stove, for example, where my grandmother would tell stories of her native Syria, of the village that she was born in, and my grandfather was born in the Karahan, and of the olive trees and of the fig trees, fruits and vegetables that my father only dreamt about in books. He never saw them until years later when he traveled to the Middle East, or when Montreal became there was a wholesaler in Montreal who was able to send out Syrian goods like olives and different types of the ingredients needed for Syrian cooking to families out west, where you would collect them at the post office in Burnaby, for instance. But those evenings, my father remembered well. Those are the happy times. The kids would get together and listen to my grandmother telling all these stories about the old country, the Arabian Nights, stories of the Arabian Nights, sing songs from the time of her childhood and her mother's childhood. It was a nostalgia that kept, I think, my grandparents going, especially at the time like Christmas and Easter, when eventually more Syrians did arrive in Saskatchewan, and usually immigrants immigrate to an area where they know someone, or there's a cousin or someone from the same village or town. And they did meet them, and it was exciting for my grandparents and for my father and his siblings too, to see my grandparents happy. They were speaking their own language. They were the same idiosyncrasies of culture were involved, and they would come and stay not for one night, they'd stay for 2 or 3 nights. That was the exciting time. But my father always dreamed of going beyond the farm. And when it was time, he joined the Air Force, the Canadian Air Force, hoping that he would travel the world. is those books that he had read in the Minot school had opened his mind to this concept that there were people out there that lived differently but more interesting than the prairies of Saskatchewan. And my father was sent to England for a year plus, and that's all. He didn't go anywhere else. He had dreamt of seeing the pyramids. He had dreamt of seeing the Great Wall of China. He had dreamt of seeing the White Cliffs of Dover, everything he'd read about in the books. And that happened later when he, after the service, and he came back to Toronto and stayed there, married my mother. He raised us. And his dream, like I said, was to travel the entire world, which he did. And I believe he traveled to over 125 countries. But he never forgot Saskatchewan. He never forgot the land, the area where my grandparents nourished their family and were able to, despite the odds that they faced. Many times when we were children, we would go back to Saskatchewan. He'd show us where the original homestead was, where the farm was. Neville, where my grandparents eventually opened a cafe there. But Saskatchewan was always in his mind. He wrote about it. He wrote about Canada, but he wrote about his love of the foods of the world, especially the Arab foods that we are all accustomed to, and now that are all over the worldwide markets as the part of the Mediterranean diet. These same foods that the bullies at school used to make fun of him about, fun of when he or my uncle were eating the foods. He wrote about everything he saw. He wrote wanting you to understand, if you couldn't be there, that you could feel and sense and see what was around him, that the world has so much to offer and so much to see. And I believe that is why when he received Canada's Meritorious Service Award for his writings, he felt proud, more proud than ever, of what he was, who he was, and what he had done. And he always thanked Canada for that honor and recognizing him. We miss him. But his writings are all here. Many books. He's written cookbooks, he's written travel books, he's written articles for journals and so on. So he's always with us. And he is the inspiration. He's the inspiration for my sister and I when we continue our writing. He's the inspiration for his grandchildren and for his great-grandchildren too. Many memories, many intelligent conversations, a much talented man and a much missed one.